Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Greetings, folks. It's great to see you this week as we continue our study in the Word, another in a series of lessons from the International Sunday School series. We start a 3-week series from the book of Psalms.
Yes.
Yeah, and you can never go wrong in the Psalms,
right.
Can you? Yeah. So this is the great hymnal of the Israelite people.
And these are 3 Psalms, 3 chapters that we don't often turn to.
Right. I have to admit, they were somewhat unfamiliar to me. You mentioned that you had your attention
91.
called to 91, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks here. But I have to admit, these are 3 that I hadn't spent a lot of time with, and they're good, of course, as all the Psalms are. I think it's important to remember that the Psalms were the hymnal of the early church as well. Long before there was a New Testament, and even as Christians were composing hymns. In fact, we may have seen one a couple of weeks ago when we were studying in Philippians chapter 2. But they were singing from the Psalms.
But Paul talked about psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, and they had this book full of songs for the Old Testament, so Christians surely used them.
They took advantage of it, and we still do today. The collection of Psalms, 150 of them, collected into what looked to be like 5 subsets, sub-5 books, 5 anthologies, represent an amazing diversity chronologically, just Psalms from various periods of Israelite history.
And it's really typical. Of course, a lot of churches today don't use hymnals at all, but if you have a hymnal, it's full of songs, and yet most people don't know that some have come from several centuries back and some have been written in the current century or so.
Yeah. We even have a few that we still sing that are as old as the 400s, 500s AD, just a few. And then some that are contemporary. So there's a wide chronological range. There's also a variety of authors to the Psalms, some of which we know, some of which we don't know.
Right.
And there's also a range in types of songs. Some are just pure praise. Some are thoughtful thanksgiving.
Some are wisdom type, almost teaching psalms.
Yeah. And the most common type of psalm is a lament.
Yes.
Which is interesting because it shows that the Israelites and God, for that matter, valued and welcomed the outpouring of Christian of religious grief. And yet, interestingly enough, every one of those lament psalms of mourning, includes some expression of trust in God. So it's always in that context.
It's the reality of what life is like. It's not always easy, not always good. Sometimes things are really hard, and sometimes you cry out to God, why and where are you? But you come to the point where it's a matter of faith. You still live by faith.
So, and that works both ways. It reminds us that living in faith, living in trust, doesn't necessarily remove all sadness from our lives. Yeah, goes that way as well. Well, speaking of multiple authors on these various psalms, we should mention that the psalm we're studying today, number 48, says it was composed by the who?
Sons of Korah.
The Sons of Korah,
Right.
Now, is that an old country western
Well,
group
sounds
or something
almost like it,
that? The Sons of the Pioneers or something like that?
Apparently it was a musical group connected to the temple.
Yeah.
In the latter part of the temple, probably after Solomon, obviously sometime after Solomon after that.
Yeah. The temple had, was served by Levites. And not all Levites were priests. Many of them had servant roles at the temple, other than the priestly role. And one of those roles was worship music. And there appears to have been a temple orchestra,
musicians,
and a temple choir.
Yeah.
And sometimes there are references to the choir master, as we're going to see actually in a couple of the future Psalms we look at. So the Sons of Korah may well have been a group of those Levitical musicians who got together and composed songs. And we're in a section of the Psalms where a number were written by this group, the Sons of Korah, whoever they were. One more thing about the Psalms by way of introduction is just, I know we've reminded our viewers of this before, but it's so essential to see, to be reminded that parallelism is the key poetic device. Remind us what we're talking about.
Well, it's most often you see it as couplets, where there's a statement in a line, and then the next line really has the same idea, sometimes with synonyms, sometimes with antonyms that will flip it around the back way, but it's the same idea.
So reaffirms the same point,
And sometimes there are antithetical psalms, lines where it's saying one thing, but then the second line is but.
Yes.
And you got a contrast.
And every once in a while, the second line shows the result of the first line. That's yet a different kind of parallelism. But most frequently, the second line restates the meaning of the first line in slightly different words.
One commentary was saying that where we're familiar in our culture with rhyming words, in a sense, the Hebrew poetry with parallelism is the rhyming of ideas.
So it's not sound rhyme, it's thought rhyme.
The thoughts.
Oh, very good. And we'll try to remember to point out some of those parallels as we go through this text. Now, one more thing by way of background before we get into our text. Jerusalem is never mentioned in this psalm.
But not by name.
But it's all about Jerusalem, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So Jerusalem functioned for the Israelite people both as a literal reality, a very important literal reality, and as a symbolic reality. So let's talk about that just for a second.
It was the national capital, but it was also the location of their place of worship. Initially, tabernacle when David made Jerusalem the capital, but then eventually the temple when Solomon built it. But it was the choice of the city that was significant.
And David was no dummy when it came to choosing a capital. Jerusalem had a number of advantages. Maybe we can quickly name them. Military, defensive purposes, it was good.
It was up higher, looking down on the surrounding areas.
With fairly steep approaches to it. So very defensible militarily. What about economically? Was it useful?
Well, it was near the trade routes, but especially significant was that it was a neutral city. It had not been controlled by Israel initially. The Jebusites had it. And so when there was a northern-southern conflict and rivalry almost, David united those two and made this the capital and had that neutral background. So, but it was near the borderline between the two.
It was still just barely into the tribal region of Judah, which was his tribal region. So he didn't betray his tribe, but it was on the far northern edge of it, like you say, that he didn't feel like, the Northerners didn't feel like they were being abandoned.
Very similar to the United States choosing Washington, D.C. Near the Mason-Dixon line.
The Northerners wanted New York or Philadelphia, the Southerners wanted Richmond, and so they picked a neutral spot right in the middle. Okay, so literally speaking, Jerusalem was a very important political, military, and economic reality in the lives of the people ever since David made it the capital and Solomon built the temple there. But Jerusalem and the hill on which it was built, Zion, also functioned symbolically, didn't they?
There's a lot of reference to, that's the tallest mountain. Well, physically it isn't.
Yeah.
But it was big in importance and
Yes.
significance.
The fact that the temple was put there meant it was kind of the focal point for the worship of God, and so that was its main significance. And it almost functions symbolically, Jerusalem, for the covenant people themselves and for the presence of God in the midst of his covenant people, in the way that the tabernacle had once symbolized God in the midst of his moving covenant people.
And at the point when, after Solomon, the kingdom split into northern and southern again, as the prophets talked about the sins of the northern kingdom in breaking away, it was the sin of pulling away from David's family, which had been promised to be the Messianic family, but also pulling away from Jerusalem and from that focus of worship. And so it was a rejection of Yahweh as God by rejecting his choice for king and his place for worship.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. So Jerusalem kind of stands for the presence of God. Well, let me read this passage here. It's 2 sections from Psalm 48, starting in verse 1. Great is the Lord, and most worthy of praise, in the city of our God, his holy mountain. Beautiful in its loftiness, the joy of the whole earth, like the heights of Zaphon, is Mount Zion, the city of the great King. God is in her citadels. He has shown himself to be her fortress. And skipping to verse 9, within your temple, O God, we meditate on your unfailing love. Like your name, O God, your praise reaches to the ends of the earth. Your right hand is filled with righteousness. Mount Zion rejoices. The villages of Judah are glad because of your judgments. Walk about Zion, go around her, count her towers, consider well her ramparts, view her citadels, that you may tell of them to the next generation. For this God is our God forever and ever, and he will be our guide even to the end. Well, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. I think we sing that some,
Yes.
and you're right, the word praise is halal, the source of our word hallelujah, ultimately. So here's an emphasis on the greatness of the Lord. Let's see, all caps, right?
I was going to say, it's important to emphasize it's the name for Yahweh.
Okay.
The special, not just any God, but this is the God of covenant.
Yeah. God is referred to in a couple different ways in this psalm. Here we have Yahweh, the Lord, in verse 1, God, later in verse 1, and then King, down in verse 2.
The great King.
Yeah, the great King. So a couple of different terms to describe God. It's interesting to note that Jerusalem is not mentioned by name here, but there is a reference to the city of our God, which is Jerusalem.
Yeah.
We both read a commentator who made a point out of the fact that Jerusalem was usually called the city of David, but here we're reminded it's not just David's, it's God's, the city of our God.
Yeah.
Now, saying that it sits on a holy mountain is not really a comment on the holiness of that piece of land.
Right.
It's really God that
and
is
even
holy.
to call it a mountain is a little bit
Right.
dramatic.
Yeah. But the holiness here, I think, is being ascribed to God, because Jerusalem in this psalm is a symbol of God and God's presence. So it's God who is holy. That's what's really important, not so much the mountain. Now, when we come to verse 2, you've already made the point that Jerusalem is not the loftiest mountain in the world, right?
Not by height.
No, but beautiful in its loftiness. It is on high ground. It is elevated.
Yes, it's high, but it's not compared to even the mountains of Appalachia, it's not very high.
Yeah.
When you think of the Rockies or some of the
Yeah.
high mountains of the world, it's not high at all.
It's a molehill, right?
Right.
But it's, as you pointed out so well earlier, it's its significance that makes it elevated. Joy of the whole earth is the second line of verse 2. That's reminiscent of some of the prophetic lines, like in Isaiah, which picture all the earth streaming toward Jerusalem to honor Yahweh.
Yeah.
So joy of the whole earth. There's a very universal feel to this. Now, our English translations have quite a variety, or some variety, of translation of the third line of verse 2 with this word Zaphon. Let's talk about that just for a second. Like the heights of Zaphon is Mount Zion.
Some just say the north.
Yeah, that's what the word means, the north. It's a little hard to understand why he would have said, like the heights of the north is Mount Zion. Maybe he's comparing it to places like Mount Hermon, up north, saying it. Now Hermon is really high.
It's a high mountain.
It's high, snow-capped and all that. Yeah. So he says, for its significance, in its spiritual significance, it's like Hermon. It's high. That could be. But there is another significance to Zaphon that was kind of appealing to us. What's going on there?
That name was known among the people of Canaan in ancient times as the mythical seat of the highest deity of the worship of Baal or Baal, the god El. And Zaphon was almost like a Mount Olympus to the Canaanites.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. If that's what the author is thinking of there, he's saying something like this, that Mount Zion, the place that symbolizes God's presence in his temple among his people, is to be compared to the great Mount Olympus of the Canaanites, Zaphon. But it's even loftier than that.
Yes.
Even loftier than that. Yeah. The city of the great king. So there's another ascription to God. Now, verse 3 is interesting because this is a perfect example of parallelism, isn't it?
With two lines.
Yeah. First of all, if you just read the first line, you would say, what does this mean? God is in her citadels. A citadel is like a fort or a palace or a castle, a defensive castle. Is that really what he's saying? That we can tell God is here because Jerusalem is a well-defended city? But fortunately, we have the second line to help us. So
he's shown himself to be her fortress, which is a synonym of citadel.
Yeah. So it isn't about Jerusalem. We keep saying, but I think we need to keep reminding ourselves that this psalm about Jerusalem isn't really about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a symbol of God. And it's God who is our fortress.
Yeah, himself.
Yeah. Not just the city. The city is a symbol of refuge, protection, etc. Well, it's at this point that our text skips several verses which talk about the deliverance that God effects and how Jerusalem is going to be invulnerable and invincible. That wasn't literally true, was it?
And so this must have been written before Babylon destroyed the city and carried off captives.
Yeah.
And before, later on, the Greeks came through, and before the
Romans eventually come and destroy it. So whenever this was written, and you're probably right, it was written before those destructions. But I think even then, the real point isn't that Jerusalem is invincible, because clearly it wasn't, but that Israel's God, the God of the city, was invincible. So that's the point.
If the city is a symbol of the worship of God, you can destroy the symbol, but you don't destroy the relationship with God or God himself.
Yeah,
And that's really what it's talking about.
And we do see that later in Israelite history. Even though Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, Judaism did not end.
Right.
And even though Rome destroyed Jerusalem, Judaism did not end. So it's about God. It's not really about Jerusalem, ultimately. Now, when we come to verse 9, we finally get to, we have the word temple.
First time.
Yeah, for the first time. Within your temple, we meditate on your unfailing love. Now, unfailing love is a translation of a nearly untranslatable word, but it may be the most important word in the Old Testament.
So often used in the Old Testament, the word hesed.
Yeah.
And it's the deep covenant love of God, but as you say, it's so hard to translate because it covers a wide variety of expressions and emotions, but ultimately it's that covenant love of God.
Yeah, and keeping the covenant in our minds when we talk about hesed. Did you read someplace? I think I read someplace it appears 250 times in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's very important. But keeping that word covenant in mind, it's a kind of love based on the mutual promises between God and his covenant people. And so it's very important. Sometimes it's translated steadfast love.
Right.
That is a love that hangs in there, that doesn't
The old King
doesn't quit.
James was loving kindness.
You know, I still love that translation. The only thing it lacks is a clear reference to this idea of steadfastness or unfailing, as the NIV puts it here.
Yeah.
And those are good concepts to remember. But loving kindness is a very lovely translation. Well, verse 10, 9 and 10 remind us that the focus is really on God, isn't it? He's talking directly to God here. He was talking about God in verses 1, 2, and 3. Now he's talking to God. Like your name, O God, your praise reaches to the ends of the earth. Remind us about name, because it doesn't just mean Yahweh, the name of God.
The concept of name, both in Old and New Testaments, is more than just a title. It's the nature or the character of the person. And so when you're talking about praying, for instance, in the name of Jesus, it's in the character of Jesus, the relationship we have with God through Christ.
Yeah. The other thing interesting about verse 10 is the statement that your praise reaches to the ends of the earth. In other words, this is not just about the covenant people, although they're prominent here. God is to be praised by all people. And Jerusalem, as I mentioned, was viewed by the prophets as a place where, or at least the symbol of the reality in which all nations would eventually come to recognize God.
Israel was to be a light to the nations, and even though they rejected that role, that was the intention of God.
Yeah. Now the word right hand, the phrase right hand, suggests power in Scripture. But the power of God isn't just military power or political power. It comes from what?
It's righteousness.
His righteousness, yes. Which can be translated justice. His just acts of justice. Now, Mount Zion is rejoicing. The villages of Judah are glad. When you say Mount Zion is rejoicing, well, that seems nutty in a way. The city is rejoicing. Well, and then we read the parallel line. It's the people who live in the villages around it. It's the people who are glad because of God's righteous judgment.
His verdict.
The next two verses, we don't need to interpret much. He says, go ahead, just walk around Jerusalem.
Take a look.
Just look at its walls, look at its towers, look at its gates, look at its. Just take a look at it, and then tell people about it.
You mean tell the next generation?
Yeah, tell the next generation. But clearly, it read in the context of this whole psalm, it's not. He's not saying brag about Jerusalem, is he? What do you think he is?
Get enough look at it to realize what it's symbolizing, what it is that it means.
Yeah, and what it means is in the very first verse. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. This is the city of our God. It stands for, it symbolizes our God. So look at this great city and then say, how great is our God? Yeah. Well, our text ends in verse 14 with a beautiful statement, this God. So that's a reminder. This really isn't about the city. It's about the city's God. This God is our God forever. He will be our guide. There's a new metaphor for God, insight, leader, guide.
And when I read this, it brought to mind the images of the Exodus, the pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night, that God was a guide for the people, and he's still our guide today.
Yeah. And what it literally says is he will be our guide even to death. So here we have kind of a personal hope that God is with us to the end, the end of our own earthly existence even, kind of reminder of Jesus' last words, I will be with you even to the end of the age. So it's a beautiful conclusion. This mention of God as guide kind of inspired me to go back and look at all the wonderful things that are said about God. Maybe you can help me pull them out. I'll just get us started. God is great. God is to be praised. God is holy. That's in verse 1. What else do we have here?
Well, then you move on to he himself is our fortress.
Okay, verse 3, fortress or refuge. God is characterized by chesed, according to verse 9. We said God is characterized by power, but power especially defined as righteousness.
And judge. He's
judge. Verse 9. Verse 11, because of your judgments. And then finally the one we were talking about, guide or leader. It's a beautiful collection of ascriptions to God.
This particular Psalm 48 is one of what several that are called the Zion songs. 46, 76, 84, 87, Psalm 122. Some of those really are familiar to us and have some tremendous praise of God. This one is not as familiar, and yet it's part of that series of Zion songs, and it'd be worth looking at the comparison, reading some of the others, because some of those really sing the praise of God in even a stronger way than this.
Read the numbers to us again. These are the Psalms.
Psalm 46 as well as 48, 76, 84, 87, and 122.
Okay, these are ones that put the focus on Jerusalem, Zion as a symbol of the greatness of God. Good. We'll need to do that. Well, Christians take seriously the symbolism of Jerusalem because right at the end of the book of Revelation, it says that we live in the hope of a new Jerusalem.
Right, the holy city.
Where it comes down to earth. It's not that we go up to New Jerusalem in the heavens someplace, but that the New Jerusalem, God's righteousness, God's greatness, His praise is once again returned to the experience of human beings on earth. God is in our midst.
Right.
He will be our guide to the very end. I will be with you always.
Yeah.
Well, folks, these are the promises that we live with, and we're grateful for this lesson, having reminded them and called them to our attention. We hope that you're able to live joyfully this week. Even though we don't live in the city of our great God, we live in the promise and the reality of His presence with us. Thanks for being with us this week. We look to see you again soon.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.